I'm your host, Paula Farmer. As part of our tribute to Black History Month, Bookpassage is featuring and has been featuring events like today and other special discussions. Just a couple weeks ago, some of you may be familiar, we did our annual Race in America panel event, which was broken down into a series of 3 conversations each night featuring 2 authors and activists, and it was just fantastic, dynamic. I really encourage you, if you haven't kind of accessed that live, feel free to go to the Bookpassage YouTube channel and you can dig it up. It's Race in America 2023. It featured authors and activists like Roberto Lovato and Reina Leon and Daniel Black and Mei Chai. So they were just dynamic. So like I said, you can access that in our YouTube channel where you are now. But for tonight, we're highlighting the life and legacy of civil rights icon Rosa Parks. I met our featured author, H.H. Leonards, just a few months ago, after I had accessed her new book, which is right behind me here. And she had such a great in-store conversation that I asked her then and there, I want you to come and do one online with us. And what a great opportunity for Black History Month. But I wanted to get the conversation around her book and her relationship with Rosa Parks, as well as her in conversation partners, projects. I thought this was a great opportunity to get them in a room together, so to speak, virtually, and have a really great, interesting discussion that everybody can be a part of. So the name of the book is Rosa Parks Beyond the Bus, Life Lessons and Leaderships. It is a collection of inspiring and instructive memories compiled from the decade that Mrs. Parks was a guest in our author H.H. Leonards' Washington, D.C. home. During those years, Mrs. Leonards was able to know the heart, mind, and spirit of the woman who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, December 1st, 1955. H.H. Leonards is the founder of the mansion on O Street Museum, PIR Marketing, Beauty Unites, and co-founder of 51stepstofreedom.org. The mansion on O Street in Washington, D.C. is an enterprise whose higher purpose is to provide a unique forum where people can come together to learn from one another and foster development of diversity and the creative process. In conversation, we're so fortunate to have with Ms. Leonards is Dr. Ladonna Boyd, who has been leading the historic R.H. Boyd Publishing Corporation since 2017, focused on nurturing faith and responsible for uplifting Black voices. RHB has been a pivotal force across mediums. With that, I'm going to hand it into Dr. Boyd's very capable hands. Thank you two for joining us.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's certainly an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to speak with the wonderful H.H. Leonards. I know we've had quite a few conversations, certainly as of late, on the topic of this book, and so we're certainly always honored and we admire this organization for understanding the importance of this work. So good evening again, Ms. Leonards, and again, thank you for being here.
It's honored always to be by your side, whether it's physically or online, because you are an extraordinary, focused, powerful mover and changer of hearts throughout the world. So thank you for everything.
Well, you are too kind. Thank you so much. And this is our, I guess, first time talking again since we recently saw each other in DC at the lovely O Mansion. So again, thank you for your hospitality there. And so let's just start by talking about just your journey. So starting with the O Mansion and its historical significance in DC, and then we'll certainly segue into how that intersects with the story of Mrs. Parks.
So I started with no money, no business background, no art background, no design background. I'm an example of what you can do in America with a vision and a mission and not listening to any naysayers. When I came to Washington, I wanted to help my country, and I came as a nanny for 7 children, and I didn't meet anyone that wanted to do anyone but help themselves. I was very disillusioned, and I started to have visions, and I firmly believe it's visions from God of what my role in the world was to make it a better place. And that was to create a place filled with art, filled with love, filled with objects that would remind people of who they used to be so they could refocus who they wanted to be that day, not who they had become. And that's what's happened here. When I moved in, I had no furniture. I had a few books because books are so important. And for me, they're the window to the world. And I had a few albums at the time. It was before CDs, and slept on the floor. And one of our heroes in residence started because I heard a homeless man singing in a used clothing store. His voice was extraordinary, and I thought it was on the radio at the time. And I came running out, who's playing on the radio? And they said, oh, it's a homeless man singing for clothes. Wow. And I invited him to sing at the house that night. Everyone came with a potluck dinner. We sat on the floor. We had a wonderful meal, shared a meal, and he started singing, and no one talked the rest of the evening. They just listened to this gentle person creating music. And I did not know at the time that they said he was homeless, but I didn't believe he was sleeping on the street. But in the winter, he showed up and said, can I sleep inside? It's cold out. And I watched him over a series of 3 winters learn how to become Bobby Short. He never sang the same song twice. He was a Vietnamese vet, and he opened the window for other people because he was so gracious and kind to be part of our Heroes in Residence. So that's how it all started. And that's actually how Mrs. Parks came to live at our house, because she had been severely assaulted in her home and didn't have money, and came, is that
my dog, yeah.
What's his name?
That's Sasha. She does not understand the concept of Zoom, so my apologies for
No, she wants to be the center stage. I think it's wonderful.
Yes, always.
And do you play? I see the grand piano behind you.
I do, yes.
Oh, nice. What kind of music do you create?
Oh, I like to play jazz and some gospel, and certainly hymnals. You can see my hymnal sitting right there. So I love playing hymns, just learning and playing things by ear and reading a little sheet music as well. So, yeah. Yeah. So you've always had a heart for the people, and it's fascinating talking about what you've done with the homeless individual, being a nanny, and then certainly your intersection with Mrs. Parks and just opening your home to her at a time where she was very vulnerable, both physically and emotionally, and certainly mentally as well. So we talked about in the book just her healing journey, how it started from physical to emotional, spiritual, like all of these things had to essentially be reconciled, and she was able to find essentially an oasis at the O Mansion right in the middle of DC. So can you talk a little bit more, certainly for context for the viewers, how you came about kind of curating this space? Of course, it's very historically significant. It's an interesting interior. It's very I'd say like quirky and an eclectic mix of all kind of things, all kind of genres and art and experiences and pop culture. So can you talk a little bit just about how you curated your space? And then we'll talk about the specific space that Mrs. Parks was able to stay in, because I got to visit and it was quite beautiful. And essentially every square inch, every corner of the mansion has something unique to offer.
It happened because we say yes to anything that comes our way.
Okay.
We, don't eliminate anything that someone gives with their heart. And the reason for that is Washington's an international city, and everyone has a different memory from their childhood. So it was important that we have something that reflects the world and humankind, so that people can relate to it. When they come in, they can see something that they forgot about themselves and reconnect.
Yeah.
And there's 112 rooms now. There weren't that many when I moved in, but there, and each ceiling, you can see the ceiling that you're looking at right now. We're in the garage right now, but each ceiling is different to get people to look up and understand that they're just a little piece of the world, reach out, help other people.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the doors too, because that is fascinating.
There's 80 secret doors here. And the genesis of that came by accident, but I also don't think it was an accident. It was God's plan, because when my oldest was born and came home from the hospital, I started telling him about the people that lived between the walls of the mansion. And he believed they were real. It was about the wolf family, and he thought they were real wolves. And when he became about 18 months, I called my father, who taught for 50 years, and said, I think I've created a problem. When he finds out that the wolf family is not here, he's not going to believe anything I ever tell him. And unlike children find out about Santa Claus when they're 7 to 12, he's going to be too young. He will never trust me again. And my father said, I love you. You're absolutely right. I'm glad you know that. You're creative. You'll figure out a way. Tell me when you do. And he hung up. And I went, okay, I'll figure it out. And that's how the secret doors came. And what's interesting about how things work, if it wasn't for my son and the lessons I was trying to teach them about how wonderful everyone is, no matter who they are or what they look like or what they smell like, through the stories about the wolf family, that we wouldn't be sustainable today as a museum, because there's art everywhere in museums and art galleries and people's homes, but people are searching for things within themselves. And the secret doors really mirror that search for hope. And we are flocked with people now that the pandemic is over, searching for mission and vision through the allegory of those secret doors. Mm-hmm. They are very hard to find. If you find 4 when you come, you're above average. Mrs. Parks, when she lived here, and she was here approximately 10 years, found 3. But she was the magic throughout all the halls here. She was extraordinary.
Yes. So talk about how you essentially got the initial request for Mrs. Parks, and then just talk us through kind of how, I've actually never asked you this. How did you pick the room for her, and how is it decorated? It's a beautiful, like, light blue color, and it's very unique to her. So just talk us through how that came about.
So I knew how frail she was, and she was so badly assaulted that her pacemaker was dislodged. So as soon as she got out of the hospital, they brought her in a wheelchair, and I knew that she needed to stay close to an elevator for mobility. And there were 2 rooms I felt was perfect. One became her room, and the other we called the International. And the International room is right directly across the hall. It's twice the size of the room that Mrs. Parks chose herself. But when we wheeled her in and she saw her room, she looked up, and this medallion was hand painted in clouds, and she just fell in love with the room. And she knew intuitively that she was going to be in bed for a while, and she wanted to just dream and think about what she was going to do when she got better, physically, spiritually, and mentally. And the room that we also wheeled her to, which was on the other side of the elevator, she also liked it, but she said, no, I would prefer the smaller room. And it was about 4 years before I got the courage to ask her, why, Mrs. Parks, did you choose the smaller room? And your assistant and co-founder of the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute, Mrs. Elaine Steele, got the bigger room. And she said, Mrs. Steele is so much more important than I am. And I just kind of looked at her. My eyes were like saucers. And she said, no, you don't understand. I'm Mrs. Rosa Parks, but she makes me real. She keeps me going. And that shows you how humble she was, and really how extraordinary she was. But Mrs. Steele loved her room also.
Okay. Okay. So you got the request and you obliged, and you talk about in the book as well how you weren't quite familiar with the history and the story of Mrs. Parks at that time. So can you talk a little bit more about that and just kind of that aha moment, if you will, when you realized that you had essentially like living history in your house?
It was probably the most humiliating experience I've ever had because I did not know who she was when she came. I didn't question the request. I could tell from the urgency in Mr. Willis Edwards' voice when he called and said she needed a place to that didn't cost anything. And I just said yes. I didn't Google her. I didn't ask any questions. So when I found out who she was 3 years after she had been with me, I was so embarrassed. I went to her and apologized profusely. And she listened to me babble my apology. And she said, patted me on the hand and said, no, it's okay. It's God's way. If you had known who I was, I probably would have left after a few days. But because you didn't know, I stayed because I knew you accepted me for who I am inside and not what I've done. And that's really what I always tell people. Don't judge anyone around you. Don't assume anything from them. Look at their hearts, look at who they are, and just give.
Absolutely.
Because I wouldn't have learned the lessons that I did if I had known her history, because I would have been afraid of her. I would have thought she was too famous to spend time with me.
Wow. And so for her healing journey, again, we've talked about physical healing, mental, emotional, spiritual. And I think healing is just the narrative all throughout the book. And it's certainly something that's still really, really needed in our culture and our society right now. And it's just interesting, again, how it all mixes together. And then being in Washington, D.C., essentially the epicenter and certainly the capital of this country, and where historic legislation is made. And it's still kind of the root, if you will, of so many issues in our society right now. So such a small, just petite figure, someone like Mrs. Parks, did such a big, bold act at a time where it was so dangerous for her to even be able to do that, it's hard to even fathom. And then for her just to go through life dealing with the repercussions or ramifications of that, and then being assaulted, and then at such an elderly age as well. It's just, there's so much hate, and that's still very prominent in our society right now. So I just love to hear some of your thoughts on just her healing journey in and of itself. So what did that look like when she came in? I'm sure she was bruised up, and like you said, she had to be wheeled in a wheelchair. So she needed actual physical therapy and healing. So would love to just hear some of your thoughts on kind of what helped her get over some of those humps and to be able to really shine her light again. And then after that, would certainly love to take a moment for you to read some of your favorite passages from the book as well.
Your question is really
That was
deep,
a lot.
important, and very meaningful. And she taught me that when bad things happen to you, and they will continually happen, and there's no way you can stop bad things from happening, that you need to disappear within yourself, that you shouldn't be out in public, that you don't need to tell other people what your problems are, but go into yourself and pray for who you want to become, to give you the mission and vision to survive. So I'll give you two big examples, or three actually. In the 1930s, in order for her to survive, she started documenting rape victims in the South, both men and women. She did that so she could survive, that she could find hope by giving other people a face and a name and someone to talk to and discuss their pain. When her husband died and her brother died within months of each other, she knew that she was so distraught that she checked herself and her mother into a nursing home, disappearing from the public eye, because she said she was so distraught she couldn't take care of her mother, let alone herself. So they stayed in a nursing home in Detroit for about a year. And when she came out, she had her mission. She had figured it out. She wanted to start the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development for Young Children. And she wanted to name it in honor of her husband. So it's the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute in Detroit. It still exists today. that gave her hope to survive by giving back to others, and working with children from the inner cities. And then when she came to me after, at the age of 81, she did not leave her room for 6 months. She disappeared into herself. And I was told not to tell anybody that she was staying with us, because she wanted her privacy. And after 6 months, she started going out. She never left the house without security after that. But in those 6 months, she became a fierce warrior for human rights and social justice. And she also said that the experience taught her to have more empathy for her brother who had suffered in World War II with PTSD. So that any place she went in the world, anytime in our house, because we had a Heroes in Residence program with vets, she would sit and talk to them about how she was surviving after the assault. So it was just a lesson in forgiving everyone everything, and then in the morning forgiving yourself. And she would talk about that concept over and over again. It was her faith that helped her survive, but also her experiences, because she said that when she got on the bus, unlike the stories in the history books, it was not planned. If she had known who the bus driver was, she would never have gotten on that bus. She was fiddling with money in her purse. She put it in the machine, and then she looked up and was horrified to see that it was a bus driver that she had very unpleasant experience with. And she was shaking when she sat down in the black section. She did not sit down in the white section. And he recognized her and started hassling her. But it was God, she said, but it was also Emmett Till's face, because his mother had just shown his casket, and it was in all the newspapers. So she prayed to God, please give me the strength. And she saw Emmett Till's face. So that's what gave her the strength to do what she did.
Wow.
But it was meant to happen. I firmly believe that. And all the suffering that she had throughout her life, which was a lot, was meant to teach lessons. And I am so appreciative of you, because you said yes to publishing this book, but you were also very firm about writing about Mrs. Parks' heart, writing about her soul, and about writing about life lessons and leadership, because I did not realize until you were firmly sure that's what you wanted to publish, how much she taught me. So I tell everyone, keep those journals every day, no matter how mundane you think you are writing, it's not, because you will go back and learn from your experiences in life, and you will learn the lessons also that you've learned along the way.
Absolutely. It's great what you said about essentially you have to forgive in order to heal and move forward. So to be able to overcome all of those horrific things that she and others had to deal with during that time, to be able to forgive not only for the other person, but for yourself, so that you can truly focus on healing, is something that's very deep and that's very hard. And I'm sure that's quite a challenge for all of us at any given time. So certainly do appreciate that sentiment there. So now I think it would be appropriate if you would like to read a passage or two from your book.
Okay, I will read a part of a chapter from Meeting Pope John Paul II with Mrs. Parks.
Okay.
On January 26, 1999, Pope John Paul II made a whirlwind trip to St. Louis. Mrs. Parks, Brother Edwards, and Elaine Steele were staying at the mansion when I first heard of his visit. I told Brother Willis that I thought it would be great if Mrs. Parks could meet with him. He talked to Mrs. Parks, who told him in her succinct manner that would be very nice. 2 days later, Mrs. Parks was invited to meet the Pope in St. Louis. She asked the three of us to attend with her. Brother Willis was the magic man. I don't know how he managed to get a meeting with the Pope in just 2 days, but he didn't stop there. Brother Willis somehow secured 3 flights for us all, as well as complimentary hotel accommodations in St. Louis. Mrs. Parks asked me to sit next to her on the plane. At the beginning of the flight, we simply held hands. Her hands were soft and warm. When we held hands, it was always like holding the hands of an angel. Halfway through the flight, she turned to me. I need your help. I want to write something to the Pope and read it to him. It has to be short because I can't write long letters. My hands hurt too much. Mrs. Parks, I never thought of saying anything to the Pope, I told her. I just thought it was amazing that we would have the opportunity to meet him. I was awestruck. I get to be with you and meet the Pope? This was doubly exciting for me as I'm a devout Catholic. I have about 30 crosses in my purse, I said to her, that I hope he will bless. She looked at me for a long time. She did not laugh or even smile. She also didn't judge me. She looked down at our clasped hands, and after a time she said, Lady H, you have to understand. When God gives you the opportunity to speak to anyone to get your message out, you have to seize the moment. We sat in silence for some time, still holding hands. Then she said, when you have these miracles presented to you, you must rise up to the occasion and be a messenger for what is right. I thought a lot about these moments with her as I pulled out my small Sony laptop. I wasn't nervous. I didn't even think about what Mrs. Parks was going to say. I just became her for a few moments. I think it was her hand in mine that helped me, or it might have been her telling me why it was important. I wrote a simple message as I knew she would want. As a most respected, honored, and great leader of the world, I ask your patience to address racism with your words and example. In measured, soft words, Mrs. Parks said, he's not a great leader. I replied, but Mrs. Parks, he's the Pope, I'm Catholic, and to me, he's a great man. She thought for a long while and said, no one should be called out as a great leader. We are all great men and women. Let's use the word moral leader. Again, I knew she was right. Sigh.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. So what made you select that particular passage? And also would love to hear a little bit more about your faith journey and kind of how that helped you kind of formulate your journey as well.
My husband chose the passage because he loves the story about Mrs. Parks meeting the Pope.
Yeah.
And how I think one of the most extraordinary for me moments was we thought it was just a private meeting with her and the Pope, but the doors opened and in came a procession of all the bishops and cardinals. And the first bishop, they came single file to meet Mrs. Parks, and she was sitting in a wheelchair. She was very exhausted. We made the mistake of coming that morning and not coming the night before. And about 6 feet from her, he got on the floor and crawled up to her foot and kissed her. And that moment changed my life. It taught me that it's not about the words, it's about the gestures. It said it all. I was sobbing, and it was uncontrollable. It just didn't stop. And then she gently had him stand and he kissed her hand. They spoke privately, and then he left and other cardinals and bishops came. But it was almost anticlimactic when the Pope finally came into the room because that moment was so powerful. But we had been told by the handlers of the Pope not to go up to the Pope, to wait until he came to us. And when he came into the room, he had the white robes and the hat, and he was holding the staff, and he was having a very difficult time walking because he was exhausted, but also the weight of his clothes were so heavy. And Mrs. Parks noticed that, and she asked me to please help her up out of the wheelchair so she could go up to him. And it was that gesture. No one had ever done this to the Pope before, of her seeing him in pain and getting up out of a wheelchair and coming to him to relieve him of the need to walk across this very long room, that they bonded immediately. And she read to him from the what she had written by hand. And the two of them held a press conference the next day because she asked him to do that in her letter to him, to discuss the cancer in the society in America, which is racism. They held a press conference. So she definitely sees the moment. And what was extraordinary to me is, if you look at what the Pope did after meeting Mrs. Parks, anytime he could globally, whether it was at the UN or going into a war-torn country, he talked about racism and how we needed to deal with it. So she, less than 100 pounds and 5 foot tall, moved mountains.
Absolutely. One thing that I found fascinating in the book that you talked about, and it's something that we see throughout the pictures as well, is that she enjoyed fashion. She always had on her Sunday best, and she had lots of shoes, which I loved and resonated with as well. So can you talk to us about that, like how she expressed herself in that way as well?
I never saw her in a pair of jeans or running shoes or dressed down. It was very important. She firmly believed that how you appeared was very important, because she didn't want her appearance to be used against her in any way. She also felt from a very small child that it was important to lead an exemplary life, because again, she did not want anyone to use anything against her in her mission with human rights, civil rights, and women's rights. But what was really precious is she was also a historian. So everything she wore, she documented. She wore what shoes she wore what dress, what hat, what gloves. It was really quite extraordinary. And she took great pride in being able to own shoes, because as a child, she did not have any. She worked in the fields from the time she was 6 on, barefoot. So shoes were so important to her. And it was wonderful to see her squeal with delight when she saw a beautiful pair of shoes and could afford them. And she loved hats. She would hold tea parties at the house for her friends. And she requested that everyone wear gloves and hats to her tea parties, which was really wonderful. And she introduced me to her milliner in Montgomery, Alabama, who was still in business at the age of 90. And her hat shop was directly across from where the Rosa and Raymond Parks Museum is in Montgomery, Alabama. Unfortunately, when I went back December 1st of this year to talk at the museum, the hat store was not there. So I really missed it, but it was there in spirit.
Right.
And a lot of Mrs. Parks's hats are still here at the O Museum in the mansion.
Wonderful. I did see a lot of hats around. Are all of those her hats, or do you have a collection from multiple individuals?
They are mostly, all of the hats are from her milliner. She did not wear all of them, but they came from her friend in Montgomery, Alabama. Really talented. Even, I don't know if you saw, some of the cowboy hats came from the same designer. It is amazing how creative people can be given the opportunity, and how the creativity keeps them alive. Like Mrs. Parks lived till she was 92. At the age of 87, she took swimming lessons. And she did that to teach people that you can learn, no matter how old you are, new things. But she also did it to teach that you can rise above, because as a small child, she was not allowed to swim in a swimming pool, a river, a lake, an ocean, if there were any white people around. So it was also an act of courage for her to, can you imagine learning how to swim in your late 80s? It's wonderful.
Quite
There's hope for us all.
Yes.
The other thing is, people don't know about her, is she was a vegetarian. And she had been afflicted with stomach issues all her life from the acts of hate against her all her life. So in the 1970s, before it was fashionable, she became a vegetarian, and she would eat very small meals 5 and 6 times a day. She loved Girl Scout cookies, which is why the proceeds of my book goes to the diversity program with the Girl Scouts, but she loved the shortbreads especially. But she would never eat her desserts in public. She would savor them, take them into her room, and grin as she ate them privately.
I love that. I just had my shipment of Girl Scout cookies come in, and I'm not going to admit how many I've eaten already. So fantastic. So many
Ours
of
are coming tomorrow.
Okay, good. Interestingly enough, some of the things that we just talked about, it resonates a little bit deeper, certainly during just Black History Month and recent conversations that I've had. So everything from swimming, like you said, like she wasn't allowed in public pools and places where white people were swimming. And we still see the ramifications of that to this day with higher rates of drowning for Black youth and just a fear, if you will, of water for still many members of the Black community, because that's something that was ingrained for so many and for so long that it's still something that I think culturally we have to overcome. And we talked about, of course, expression through fashion. We recently did a panel on kind of the intersection of Black creatives and Black History Month and how fashion is really used to express ourselves creatively. And the idea of the Sunday's best, like presenting yourself in Sunday's best, something that was very important, especially during the Civil Rights Movement, to kind of lower or lesser a little bit of that division between communities and cultures by always presenting yourself in the best light. And I think that's still something that in our culture is very important in and of itself. And of course, the hats, the church hats and things like that is still very prominent. So it's just interesting to see. I think when we think of individuals like Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and so many others, it seems like it was so long ago, and it wasn't. It's recent history in the context of where we are in this country, in this community and culture. So things have shifted quite a bit over the past few decades, but we still have a significant amount of ways to go. So,
Mrs. Parks succinctly said over and over again, the struggle continues, the struggle continues, the struggle continues. And we must not forget that.
Absolutely.
She also told me something over and over again that I did not understand at the time. And it wasn't until I started writing this book and then all the events that have happened over the past few years that she would say to me, I'm so frustrated because the laws changed, but people are hiding behind them. If we don't get out and change people's hearts, the laws will roll back. And that is exactly what's happening now. And that's why I'm thanking you also for publishing this book, because this is about changing people's hearts. It's about focusing on our commonalities. It's about focusing on what God teaches us. And that is believing in something bigger than ourselves, to come together. Because you can't change people's hearts if you don't talk to people that don't believe the way you do. And it's not about changing who they are. It's about opening up their hearts to understand that we have so much more in common and hate is out of fear. So Mrs. Parks used to also tell me, I'll meet with anybody. I'll talk to 2 people, 1 person, 10 people, 12,000 people. I want to shake their hand so that they could feel me and not fear me, because she was so believed that racism is from fear. It's from the unknown.
Absolutely.
And the other thing she taught me was to let go of your ego. And I was giving a talk to a group in Southern Virginia, and I talked about letting go of ego. And one of the gentlemen in the room said in the Q&A, do you know what ego is? And I said, well, explain it to me. And he said, it stands for edging God out. And I was stunned, and I didn't know what to say except for Mrs. Parks is smiling down at all of us. And then it was a breakfast meeting, and we all went outside after, and there was a rainbow in the sky, and it was Mrs. Parks. And when it was edging God out is ego.
Mm. That's definitely very, very true. And dying to yourself and minimizing your ego is something that is so difficult for so many. It's an everyday struggle. And I think being able to take yourself out of the equation and figure out how can we affect change that will help better the community and better everyone versus just myself is something that is, again, a daily struggle for so many. So thank you for bringing that up. We've received a few questions from the audience. I do want to take a moment to address some of those. I want to encourage all audience members to add any additional ones. We'll try to get through all of these, and then we'll circle back just to the conversation as well. So I'll just take these in the order that I've received them so far. So the first question, it's actually about our company, RH Boyd, and wanting to know, is it the first and our only Black-owned book publisher? No, we're not the first or the only Black book publisher. There are quite a few. We are one of the oldest continuously operating Black publishers. So founded in 1896 by my great-great-grandfather. So 5 generations later, we are still going strong. So it's quite a unique and rich history. So I certainly encourage anyone that wants to know more to visit our website, rhboyd.com, where we talk about the history of the organization and provide additional tools and resources. All right, the next question, let's see. This one was already addressed. Was Mrs. Leonards familiar with Mrs. Parks and her history before meeting her? So as we addressed, that no, you weren't, and you actually learned more about that after being able to spend that time with her in the mansion. All right, the next question, how did what was supposed to be Mrs. Parks' stay for only a few weeks turn into several years? And we did address that as well. She felt very comfortable, but would you like to elaborate on what made Mrs. Parks feel comfortable staying for that extended period of time?
She, when she was physically better, she did travel. She did go back to Detroit to her institute and working with the inner city kids, but she loved disappearing into the sanctuary of the old museum and the mansion. So she really spent a lot of time with us. And also it was a period where she was being reacquainted with Congress, and she got her numerous awards here, and she felt it was important to spend time with the leadership coming from all over the world to Washington to talk to the politicians here. And it was just it was a safe haven for her and a safe place. And she loved it here. And I loved being with her. And my most precious moments with her were really just holding hands with her. We didn't need to talk. She could express how she was feeling through her hands. And that is a remarkable thing.
Absolutely. The next question, how would you, Mrs. Leonards, describe your relationship with Mrs. Parks? Was it a friendship, mentorship, or was it more like family?
She was the mother that I always dreamed I would have. I think I was one of her many daughters that she always dreamed that she would have. She really wanted to have children, and she took the adversity of not being able to have her own and adopted the children of the world. And she treated all of us, and we're all, doesn't matter what age you are, you're still children of heart. She treated us all equally and so lovingly. I don't know if I would have a definition of what our relationship was other than being able to spend time together. When I found out who she was, I got to travel with her. So she was thrilled that I finally knew what she had done so I could become her traveling companion, which was extraordinary. And that's when I learned so much about the movements. And I do movements in the plural that she was a part of, because she did so much and doesn't quite get the credit she deserves for the things that she was involved in all of her life. And that's what the book, why it's called Beyond the Bus, because there's so much. She was a humble woman, so she would not publicly take credit for the things that she had done, but other people write about it.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have currently. So again, I encourage all of our listeners to drop additional questions into that chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can before we wrap up. So my next question is, after Mrs. Parks left, so between the time that she moved out of the mansion, or well, really after her passing, immediately, what were some of the things that you were thinking about? So as you reflected on that time, because it was a pretty significant amount of time between when she passed and, of course, when we started talking about this book and really putting this pen to paper. So what were some of your thoughts immediately during that window?
So I think that it wasn't until 2019 when the Library of Congress is doing a one-woman show about Mrs. Parks, and they found out our history and came to me and asked me to please write a book, that I really had understood the depth of our relationship. And it wasn't until then that I also understood how much she had taught me and how much my life had been devoted to her and continued to devote it to her. It was in the writing that I understood what my mission would become now, which is about fighting for equality and freedom of all people. And that was really her mission. And I also had been writing before that. And while she was here, we both wrote together. She would read me passages of what she was writing. I would read her passages, what I was writing, and we shared those things together. But I never realized that everything I wrote was almost as if I was channeling through her. And it wasn't until this book that I really understand it was Mrs. Parks writing the book. It wasn't me. And there was a period in the book where I lost the book. It disappeared from my computer. We brought in forensic experts. They couldn't find it in the cloud. They couldn't find it in the computer. And I did what Mrs. Parks taught me to do. When things you don't understand, when bad things happen to you, like losing months of your work, I went to bed. I didn't talk to anybody, didn't answer the phone. I don't even think I ate that much. I just tried to sleep away and understand and pray what had happened. And then after about a week, I came out of the little room I was staying in, and I said, Mrs. Parks wanted me to lose the book. It wasn't the right book to write. And I wasn't angry at all during that week of trying to figure it out. I was just praying that to understand what had happened. And she gave me the light to start again. And it's really her words. The book flowed very easily after that. So things are meant to happen in the sequence that they happen.
Absolutely.
And I also tell people that you don't understand the impact that people have on you until much later, like your parents. You don't understand fully what they went through until you or someone in your family has children, and you can see what impact they had on you, and until you write. And I tell people, keep a journal, because that is how you understand that all the mundane things you're doing do have a reason for them to happen in a sequence. So at the time you think, oh, I lead a boring life. Not true. Because if you keep a journal of what you're writing, you'll understand the real mission of what you're doing. And everyone, like Mrs. Parks said, is a great leader. Everyone has the potential to do that. You just have to say, I'm going to start a movement. I don't need money. Look at me. I started a business with no money. I still have no personal money, and it's still here after the pandemic or after the ups and downs of the economy or 911, because it's meant to happen. You just have to keep on going.
Absolutely. Keep on going and push through. So when you're, I think, called, especially if it's a divine calling or purpose, and whatever obstacles are thrown at you, you'll always be able to overcome those things. And this next question, we had another one come through. It's quite fascinating. So this one says, was Mrs. Parks and other women appreciated within the civil rights movement, which was led by and mostly focused on male leadership? Was she appreciated at that time, or was it later in life?
I, just from observing and not just from observing Mrs. Parks, I think that many times she was marginalized. From the moments after the bus, they would not, when she went to speak, even though she was asked to speak, the men would push her to the side and say, "You've done enough, let us talk." She never argued, she never tried to push her way in. It happened during the Selma March where she was pushed to the back of the line and said, "You don't belong here, what are you doing here?" But when you see the pictures of that march, she's in the front line with the men, but only because the press said, "Where's Mrs. Rosa Parks? She should be up here." So they went to the back where she had been pushed aside, but she kept on marching, and they brought her to the front. People took her photograph. When Nelson Mandela came to the United States for the first time, he said he wanted to go to Detroit because that's where Mrs. Parks lived. And she was invited, but all the politicians pushed her to the back. So the plane, at that time, you could go meet the planes. There were thousands of people there. They pushed her to the back. Mr. Mandela stood on the airplane. He didn't come down the stairs, and he didn't see Mrs. Parks there. So he started, "Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks." And they pushed her to the front of the line so he could greet her. So she was marginalized all the time. And he said that it was Mrs. Parks that kept him alive in jail and in prison all those years because of what she taught by her act of defiance. So and it's also interesting that there's so many people that were famous politicians at the time or famous leaders in all sorts of different movements, but it's Mrs. Parks that people remember and that people love. And I also think that it's because she focused on the children of the world, because they are our future and they still are our future.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was certainly a great question. And as we're in Black History Month and that's coming to an end and segueing into Women's History Month in March, I think just having her is such a strong example of both. And I love what you said about it was others that made her be pushed to the front. So those that were immediately around her and what we consider to be her peers and fellow people in the movement were pushing her to the back, but it was others that advocated for her to be in the front where she rightfully deserved to be. All right. Well, I believe that concludes our conversation. We've got Paula back on with us from Bookpassage. And again, thank you for this opportunity to speak this evening. So with that, Ms. Leonards, if you have any kind of closing remarks or anything else that you would like to say, I hand it over to you.
Thank you for asking me the questions and being part of this. It was wonderful to listen to you and our conversation, because I always learn from you from this. So thank you. And thank you, Paula, for putting this together.
Oh, thank you both. This was fascinating. Yeah, I'm glad I think I remembered it with our In Conversation event, you mentioning the element of sexism within the movement. And I find that fascinating. So thank you for sharing that, because I think it's interesting how she was marginalized on several levels, but just quietly kept persisting and letting her voice and her passion be known. And it makes us respect and adore her even more. Thank you so much for the book. I do have to say that there is a connection, and it just shocked me when I was first reading the book. I realized that we had that connection, Ms. Leonards, because I am from Detroit. And at the time that Mrs. Parks was assaulted, I was a young news reporter, and I remember being assigned. They just gave me an address. They didn't tell me what happened. They just said, "We need you to go there." And it was there on the scene that I found out that Rosa Parks had been assaulted. And then when I read your book, I got the connection that she left from there at that time to you, and you provided her a safe haven. So interesting, kind of full circle for me in reading the book. We do have lots of Ms. Leonard's books at Bookpassage. We have them in San Francisco location. We have them in our Corte Madera location, but you certainly are welcome to order them online or order them over the phone. Any bookseller will be happy to just ring you up and give you more information. And it's in paperback, so it's very accessible. And I love it. Thank you so much to you both.
Thank you.
Dr. Boyd, this is fascinating, and you are officially enlisted in the future for moderating because you're fantastic at it, and we really appreciate you coming and doing it.
Thank you. We certainly do appreciate the opportunity to have this event and speak to your audience tonight. So thank you again.
Great. And soon we'll have more. The month is not over. We have more special events around Black History Month. And thank you for mentioning Women's History Month. That's coming up in just a few days. And we do have plenty of events focused on women's stories, women's voices. Thank you to you and to our audience. Great questions, audience. Thank you very much.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.